Hey guys, Pastor Tanner here, coming at you with another fair-minded theology video. Today's topic, covenant theology and dispensationalism. But before I jump into the content, I actually want to share a personal story with you guys because this topic is near and dear to my heart. In college, when I just started getting into Christianity and learning more about theology, I had a couple of buddies of mine, and we were all good friends. And one of my friends decided to go off to Westminster Theological Seminary. Now, all of us at the time were Baptists, Credo Baptists. We believed in believers' baptism only. And we all got together in a little powwow before he headed off to Westminster, and we almost made like a little pact, right? Baptist for life. You're not going to change. My friend left, and he came back after the first semester, and he had changed into a Paedo-Baptist. And we asked him, what happened? Why did you change into a Paedo-Baptist? And he told me this. He said, you cannot say you believe in covenant theology and still be a Credo-Baptist. My eyes went wide. I didn't understand. I didn't think I was a dispensationalist. I like to read all of these old Puritans, and I thought I was into covenant theology, but I was still learning, and I didn't realize how nuanced these waters are. In this video, I hope to clear some of that muddiness, that murkiness for you, so that you can go in with eyes wide open. I think this is one of the most important topics that the church is dealing with and wrestling with in our day and age. Really, to understand covenant theology and dispensationalism opens the door to an avenue of so many other fruitful theological topics to discuss. So many future videos are also going to be dealing with these topics in the background. As you saw, the question of baptism has to do, in a very real sense, with covenant theology and dispensationalism. Let me outline for you the book that I read and the four primary positions that are put forward. And don't go away, because up front, I am going to tell you which four positions lean towards before I jump into specifics. So even up front right here, I just want to give you some quick wins if you don't have a whole lot of time to watch the full video. Let's go ahead and jump in. So this is the book I read on the topic. It's called Covenantal and Dispensational Theologies, 4 Views on the Continuity of Scripture. It was a fantastic book, and I highly recommend it. But I want you to know it was dense. 250 pages, not the longest that I've reviewed, but the content was really meaty, and there are a lot of issues that have a lot of depth to them that are difficult to understand if you're not familiar with the conversations. Let me show you each of the 4 positions that are outlined in the book. So here on this continuum, I have tried to demonstrate the relative positions that are outlined in the book. The book's positions are across the bottom. So there are covenant theology, progressive covenantalism, progressive dispensationalism, and then finally dispensationalism. But you might be aware that there are other arguments and discussions, positions that are held when it comes to each of these issues. Theonomy finds itself more on the continuity perspective than even covenant theology itself. Reformed Baptist covenant theology is on here. And then finally, New Covenant theology occupies a range of positions between progressive covenantalism and progressive dispensationalism. I want you to know that the book did not treat any of these 3 positions, but I wanted to put them on the continuum so you could see roughly where they lie for your own studies. However, I think the book did a pretty good job of selecting 4 primary positions that are representative of the issues at hand. Let me now summarize each position really succinctly for you, just so you might have a good understanding of where you might be leaning. Do you like systematic theology? Covenant theology is right for you if you love systematic theology. Nearly every aspect of covenant theology has some sort of systematic theological distinction. They have law-gospel distinctions. They have the tripartite distinction of the law. They have conditional versus unconditional covenants. They have the covenant of works, the covenant of grace, the covenant of redemption. There's a separation between ethnic Israel, spiritual Israel. There's the visible and invisible church. There's the idea of the remnant. Covenant theology has built all of these categories, and it neatly fits many of the concepts into the categories themselves. So if you like systematic theology, you might like covenant theology. Now, do you like typological interpretation? Do you like biblical theology? Do you like an organic development of the church and God's people over time? If that's the case, progressive covenantalism is probably right for you. That's the focus of this primary area. They like that organic development of God's people over a long period of time. Now, are you interested in Israel? Do you firmly believe that Israel participates in God's blessings and continues to have an abiding significance through the end times? Then progressive dispensationalism might be right for you. You really see a big divide between progressive covenantalism and dispensationalism when it comes to the issue of Israel. We'll get into that momentarily. Finally, do you believe strongly in an original, literalist hermeneutic? Do you believe that we should take the scriptures, how they read at face value, and just read them as literally as possible? Then dispensationalism is probably right for you. There's a very strong focus on authorial intent when it comes to dispensationalism, and that comes through very, very strongly. Again, all of these occupy a continuum. Those positions on the far left side of the spectrum see more continuity between the Old Covenant people of God and the New Covenant people of God. However, people on the far right side of the spectrum see more discontinuity between the Old Covenant people of God and the New Covenant people of God. That's where things ultimately lie. Now, let's jump into a few specific issues that I think are of primary importance when it comes to discussing these topics. Issue number one, when it comes to covenant theology versus dispensationalism, is the fundamental question of, is God done with Israel? There is a firm line that separates those on this side of the spectrum from the dispensationalist side with the question, is God done with Israel? Those on the left side of the spectrum are more open to the idea that God is done with Israel, they've served their purpose, it's over. However, those on the right side of the spectrum, the dispensationalist side, think God still has plans for Israel and they still have abiding significance for today. So ask yourself that question. What do I think about Israel? That's going to roughly tell you where you land here. I think this really came out in one of the tables in the book. Notice here, this table, there are really good tables in the back of the book. You can see each position is put forth and the Israel-church relationship is described. I'm not going to describe these in depth, but you can see there's profound differences between each of the positions based on what they think of Israel. The land promises especially are one of the points of contention between each of these positions. Dispensationalists see that the land promises still need to be fulfilled in the future, so God still has something to do with Israel. However, those on the covenant theology side or the progressive covenantalism side, they tend to spiritualize the land promises. So there's some big differences there. There are also disagreements, therefore, on how each side is treating this. Some think the spiritualizing of the land promises isn't appropriate. They even say that this is a Platonizing tendency within covenant theology. They might use language like, this is replacement theology, that the church is replacing Israel, because they're not taking the land promises literally, and therefore they feel they're not taking them seriously. Closely related to the question of Israel is also the question of the church. In reality, you should ask yourself, who are the primary people of God in your mind? At the extreme ends of the spectrum, each side sees one group, either Israel or the church, as God's primary people, and they see the other group as almost a parenthesis. Okay? The dispensationalist position is marked by thinking that the church is a parenthesis in God's plan, and at the end times, we're going to get Israel folded right back in. However, over here on the progressive covenantalism and covenant theology perspective side, there was actually a position that they said, no, Israel is God's parentheses, and the church is really God's primary people. This is a really big question that you need to answer in order to determine where you land on this spectrum. On this topic in particular, I'd be remiss in my duties if I didn't mention Romans 9 through 11. This came up in almost every essay, and really the question of this, Romans 11:29, the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. The reason this gets brought up is these verses seem to indicate that God has Israel in mind with some sort of abiding validity all the way through the end of times. And so dispensationalists really like to run to these verses. But I want you to know, every position can accommodate a future for ethnic Israel. Even the covenant theology position said that they believe there's a future for ethnic Israel. Not all covenant theologians believe that, but many still do. And so I think Romans 9 through 11 is kind of a moot point, but I wanted to bring it up because these texts often get brought up in these discussions. Moving on from the questions of Israel and the church, I now want to talk about the issue of hermeneutics. I didn't realize this going into these essays, but after I came out reading them, I understood understood completely that hermeneutics is one of the primary issues here. On the far dispensationalist side of the spectrum, there is a strong commitment to a grammatical, historical, and a very literal hermeneutic. In fact, the dispensationalists attacked progressive covenantalism because they lean so heavily into typology at times. And so ask yourself this question: do you believe strongly in authorial intent? Do you believe in that literal hermeneutic? That's the dispensationalist side through and through. One of the issues here has to do with what takes priority, the New Testament or the Old Testament. Many on the covenant theology side are okay with reinterpreting the Old Testament in light of the New Testament, using a sense of a Christological hermeneutic, basically saying that the original authors didn't know the depths of everything they were getting into. However, those on the dispensationalist side sharply reject this, and they essentially say authorial intent is the primary thing that we should focus on. This makes a big difference in which position you're going to take. Fifthly, I hinted at the question of baptism in my opening story, and it certainly is a big issue. Notice that under the covenant theology perspective, there is a strong commitment overall to paedobaptism. In fact, something that I thought was very interesting is that the other three positions all are coming from a more Baptistic perspective. I believe at one point Michael Horton said that all of the other three perspectives are just an intramural debate amongst Baptists. I thought that was hilarious, and there was a sense of truth to it, because you can see each of these are Baptists trying to understand the relationship of the covenants in different ways. So if you're strongly paedobaptistic, you're going to probably lean covenant theology. Another primary text of importance when it came to these arguments was the text of Hebrews chapter 8, specifically starting in verse 8 through the end of the chapter. A real question here comes up. How new is the new covenant? Those who lean on the covenant theology side don't see much newness to the new covenant. However, those leaning in the other direction, especially the dispensational direction, see a lot of newness to the new covenant. That's where the discontinuity comes into play. How you interpret Hebrews chapter 8 is really, really important at this point. And I think it's one of the primary drivers when it comes to the issue. If you are saying to yourself at this point, Tanner, I'm not trying to decide my position based upon all of these theological ideas, tell me what the text says. I would point you to Hebrews chapter 8. Do an in-depth exegesis of Hebrews 8 and walk through that text and see where you land on this topic, because that's really going to point you in the direction of whether you're more covenant theology or more dispensational. One short thought, and then I want to jump into 4 questions that I would ask, one for each position, okay? My short thought is this. I thought it was very interesting that most of the positions didn't really know what to do with the Mosaic covenant. And I say that as lovingly as I can because each thought they were treating it well, but it was just so funny to see that everybody had a slightly different perspective on the Mosaic covenant, and it almost felt like a weird intrusion. I think that points to the fact that this is a very complicated issue. Now, here are my 4 questions. For those who are covenant theology, I would simply ask this. Are all of these systematic theological categories that you're using to form your position, are they derived from the text itself, or are you creating them from outside of the text and then imposing them? I think that's a real issue that covenant theologians need to deal with. When it comes to progressive dispensationalists, here's what I would ask. Are you overly spiritualizing the text? The typological emphasis of progressive covenantalists can be concerning at times, especially if you have a more grammatical historical background when it comes to hermeneutics. Are you really deriving the truths of the text when you're spiritualizing it as much as you are? For those who are progressive dispensationalists, here is my question. Are you so sure that the Old Testament literal applications, specifically the land promises, have abiding validity going forward? Are you so confident that these things are not subsumed and fulfilled in Christ himself? Finally, my question for those who are dispensationalists, are you so certain of your originalist hermeneutic? Are you sure that grammatical historical method of interpretation is the method that God would have us to use when it comes to understanding his word? Right here at the end of the video, let me go ahead and show you my position. Here is where I landed when it came to this topic. I landed almost dead on with the progressive covenantalist position, okay? Now, I want you to know at this point that I have not explored thoroughly Reformed Baptist Covenant Theology nor New Covenant Theology. So that's going to be a next step for me. But I found myself resonating so much with the progressive covenantalist position. I love what they had to say, and I'm very, very interested in moving forward with this. This was surprising to me because I have a covenant theology kind of background, but I just thought that this was much more in line with my understanding of the relationship of the covenants. There you have it, guys, my fair-minded review of the topic of covenant theology through dispensationalism. This was super enlightening for me, and I hope to give you more content like this in the future. Take care. God bless. Bye now.